If you want to save
You're
them.
going to die tomorrow, Lord Bolton. Sleep well.
And we're back. It's me, Swear, and thank you for stepping back into my corner for a brand new video. You've seen the title, you know what this is. We're going to be talking about Game of Thrones. Now, about 2 weeks ago, I made the House of the Dragon video, and I've really thoroughly enjoyed that. And I thought I wanted to make a Game of Thrones video, but I wasn't sure of what it was going to be and what it was going to look like and all these different things. And then it finally clicked. You know, it's been 3.5 years since the dumpster fire that was the Game of Thrones finale. And trust me, I remember that moment well. Why, you ask? Because the Game of Thrones finale aired on my birthday. Yep, that's right, look it up, 19th of May, 2019. That was when the last Game of Thrones episode came out, which is my birthday. I'm sure you can imagine exactly how I spent my birthday. And so because it's been over 3.5 years, and with House of the Dragon just recently coming out, I've been questioning and pondering to myself, how did it all go wrong? When did it all go wrong? Where did Game of Thrones go wrong? And I feel like I've come up with an answer. I should warn you, there's obviously going to be spoilers. I'm going to be talking about stuff from the show, so if you haven't seen it, get out of here, because this is not for you. So let's stop wasting time and dive right into it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the exact moment that Game of Thrones died. Now, right off the bat, I should explain that this video is going to be incredibly subjective. There are other creators out there who have made hundreds of videos explaining when, where, how, and why Game of Thrones died. But I wanted to create a video for me, in a sense where I wanted to explore the moment the show died for me and the moment that I realized, like, oh crap, this is going to be a rough ride. Now, I've seen the entirety of the show from start to finish twice. And both times that I've seen this show, there was always one specific episode that always left a mixed taste in my mouth. And that is season 6, episode 9, titled The Battle of the Bastards. Now, two things can be true at the same time. While Battle of the Bastards is probably one of Game of Thrones' most grand and epic episodes to date, at the same time, in my mind, for me, it marked the beginning of the end that was Game of Thrones. I'll start with the pros before we get to all the negative stuff that I have to say. In my opinion, this episode truly pushed the boundaries of what can be done on television. You know, before this, the silver screen was relatively familiar to smaller budgets, poorer produced products. And we as, cinema goers, we were okay with this. We understood that if you wanted to watch something grand and out there and phenomenal and epic, you have to go to the cinema, to watch something like Lord of the Rings or Titanic or all that kind of stuff. And if you just wanted something smaller, lower budget, week by week basis, you would sit down and you would watch a series at home on your own TVs. Game of Thrones became one of the very first shows to flip this narrative, in that you can display film level quality on the silver screen. The show was very boundary pushing in what television could achieve, whether it's in the cinematography, writing, directing, acting, all these different things. Game of Thrones was really at the forefront of what is capable in the television landscape. And this episode, Battle of the Bastards, was really boundary pushing in that. It was really Lord of the Rings epic quality brought down to be consumed on the TV level. Unprecedented. Phenomenal. The technical aspects of this episode have been done supremely. It is fantastic. It is flawless. It truly is such a great battle episode. And yes, while this show and a few shows out there have had really grand spectacle episodes and moments like this that have pushed the boundaries of what TV can do, this one just took the ball and freaking knocked it out of the park, man. And so if you as an audience member want to sit for an hour with your mouth open, just in awe, Season 6, Episode 9 of Game of Thrones is the episode to watch. It's incredibly suspenseful and stressful, and on its own it is a fantastic piece of television to watch. But as an episode of Game of Thrones, in my mind, this marked the beginning of the end. Now, there are indications earlier in the series that lead to Game of Thrones' downfall, yes. But in my mind, I was very much blind to those. It's only when I got to this specific episode and certain moments in this episode where I was like, oh Lord, this is not going to be pretty. And I'm actually looking at that moment right now on my laptop. After Jon Snow's brother Rickon is murdered by an arrow, in a fit of rage and emotion, Jon straight up charges directly at Ramsay and his army. As stupid as that is of Jon to do, I'm kind of okay with it. You know, he's in a fit of rage, he's emotive, and he's reactionary, and so his immediate reaction when he sees his brother die is to charge straight at the man who fired the arrow into his heart. Cool. My issues with this moment and this scene and the rest of the show occur when, after Jon's horse gets shot by some arrows and Jon is standing alone by himself, face to face with Ramsay's cavalry charging directly at him. Now let me just say, beautiful shot, by the way. They did that shot for real. It wasn't CG, and it's goddamn fantastic, beautiful. But my issue is, in that moment when Jon is standing face to face with the cavalry charging directly at him, as an audience member, the first time I watched it, I was heartbroken because I knew in that moment that Jon Snow is going to die. One of my favorite characters that I've been following since the very beginning, who's evaded death time and time again and has risen to the top of the food chain in this story, allows his hubris and his arrogance to get the better of him. He underestimates Ramsay and allows his arrogance to allow him to think that he would win the war. But he makes a vital mistake in playing directly into Ramsay's plan. Jon separates himself from the rest of his army and tries to go it alone, thinking he can do it. And in this moment, he has to pay the consequences. But he doesn't. This is the moment, to me, where Game of Thrones truly died. In the old Game of Thrones, Jon would have died instantaneously in this moment. He made a vital mistake and it would have cost him his life. But in this moment, he doesn't die. Ramsay's cavalry and Jon's cavalry, they just kind of mush into one another and Jon is left unscathed. That was the moment when I realized this show had a major problem. And this mistake is wrong on two levels. One, on a logical level. If I'm standing in the middle of conflict and there's an army of horses coming from this way and there's an army of horses coming from that way and I'm in the middle, surely when these two things come together, I die some way in all of that mess. But Jon doesn't, which to me is like, that's illogical, number one. Number two, as I mentioned previously, by not having Jon die, it sort of puts a chink in the integrity of what Game of Thrones is. As I mentioned in the House of the Dragon video, Game of Thrones is a story of actions and consequences. Jon took an action and he faced no consequences. And as the show progresses from this moment, that's typically what starts to happen. Characters make decisions and they don't face any consequences for their decisions. And those that do face consequences, typically, those consequences aren't fatal and have no impact on the overarching story. Whereas in the first 4 or 5 seasons of Game of Thrones, if a character made a decision and it was the incorrect decision, the ramifications of that decision didn't just affect that character, but it affected all the other characters around. But as we see in the later decisions, actions have no consequences. Nothing means anything. And for me, it starts here in this moment. He doesn't die. And that's not the only moment in this episode where Jon should have died. Jon's army is vastly outnumbered. They're just getting pummeled. You know, there's piles of bodies stacking up. They suck. Purely because Ramsay's army is double the size of Jon's and they have more horses and equipment and yada 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 yada. So Jon is going into this battle probably going to lose. And so after the majority of Jon's army has been totally ripped to shreds and there is a few of them left, with the way the battle's looking, surely Ramsay's army should have just like taken a sickle and just wiped out the rest of Jon's army. Just, you know, I don't know why I used a sickle, but just, you know, Ramsay's army essentially should have just ripped the rest of Jon's army to shreds, but that's not what happens. In a form of Deus Ex Machina, the veil comes through and then just kind of saves the day and allows Jon to win and be victorious over everyone else. When in reality, they should have all died, because that's what Game of Thrones used to be. Jon made the wrong decision. He went into a battle with insufficient resources, and thus he should have died for those consequences. His whole army, like I said, with a sickle, they should have been wiped out, but they weren't, and they win the Battle of the Bastards. When watching the episode for the first time, I didn't clock any of this. I didn't clock how bad this episode is for the show. I was very much blind to it. Maybe it's because I was 16 at the time and maybe I didn't have the developed prefrontal cortex to be able to understand the complexities. I don't know. But watching it back, I'm just thinking to myself, the decisions that the showrunners and writers made in this show is detrimental to their own show and to what the show is supposed to be about. And I mentioned this in the House of the Dragon video. What this episode was spectacle of the highest caliber. And as an audience member watching it for the first time, I think the reason why I didn't clock how bad this was for the show is because I allowed myself to get completely immersed in what I was seeing. There was no space for me to breathe and really consider what it was that I'm watching. You know, there were so many moments of tension and I was unsure that the people I wanted to win were gonna win. And then when they do win and they kill the bad guy, Ramsay, by the way, beautiful death. Hats off to the show. Getting eaten alive by dogs, by your own dogs. That's tough. As someone who's been bit, you can't see it on this camera, but I've been bit by my own dog. As someone who's been bit by a dog, his own dog. Trust me, dying by getting chowed by dogs sounds like a very painful way to go. And to me, that is the most befitting end for Ramsay Bolton. I'm glad he died in that way. But I don't like the way in which we got to that death. And this becomes a recurring theme in the rest of Game of Thrones. Actions with no consequences, instant gratification, actions with no real payoff, a series of unanswered loose threads, nonsensical plot armor. There's so many things that this show devolves into. And for me, when I consider it, it starts here in this moment. And now that I've saddened myself, I think I'm going to get back to studying. Yeah, that was the point of this video. I just wanted to highlight to you guys the exact moment that I truly believe that Game of Thrones died and became every other fantasy, drama, spectacle thing. You know, and as sad as it is, life goes on. You know, you can't allow yourself to get too beat up by these things. As invested as I was in this show, of course it let me down. We all know that. But it is what it is and life goes on. Now, with that being said, I'm gonna get out of here. It has been your boy Swear. I thank you for stepping back into my corner for a brand new video, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers, mate.